Fix my plane, and I'll grant one wish, the CEO said. The single dad asked for a mom what kind of wish could make someone ask for something so unexpected? And why would that single request matter more than anything else? Hello, and welcome. We're so glad you're here to share this story with us. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, family, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss future videos. Thank you for watching, for your support, and for being part of this growing community. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you were granted one wish, would you choose something for yourself or for someone you love? Now, let's step into the moment where one simple promise begins an unforgettable journey. Touch that airplane again, and you'll be paying for it with a job you don't even have. The sharp voice echoed across the private hangar, instantly silencing the mechanics who had been whispering only seconds before. Ethan Brooks slowly lifted his hands away from the open engine compartment and looked toward the woman walking across the polished concrete floor in high heels that clicked with quiet authority. She wasn't shouting because she had lost control. She was shouting because she was used to being obeyed. Amelia Kensington, founder and CEO of Kensington Aerospace, had arrived 24 hours earlier expecting her grounded jet to be repaired by one of the country's most expensive aviation teams. Instead, she found a man in faded work boots, grease-stained jeans, and an old baseball cap studying the aircraft with calm, patient eyes. "I'm not touching it," Ethan replied evenly. "I'm listening." A few mechanics exchanged puzzled looks. One of them smirked. Another quietly shook his head. Amelia folded her arms. "Listening." Ethan nodded once. "Engines tell you what's wrong if you stop trying to impress them." The remark earned a few muffled laughs from the crew. Amelia didn't smile. She had spent years building a billion-dollar company by trusting certified experts, detailed reports, and measurable results. The stranger standing in front of her looked more like someone who repaired pickup trucks behind a gas station than someone who belonged anywhere near a multi-million-dollar jet. "Our engineers have already inspected it," she said. 3 times. Ethan glanced back at the aircraft. Then they listened to the wrong sound. Silence settled over the hangar. Nobody expected him to answer like that. Nobody expected him to sound so certain without sounding arrogant. Amelia studied him for another moment before turning toward her chief engineer. "Who is he?" The engineer hesitated just long enough for Ethan to notice. "Local mechanic," he finally answered. "Independent contractor. Good reputation around here." Ethan didn't correct him. He didn't mention the certifications stored in a dusty box at home. He didn't mention the career he had quietly left behind years ago. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was finishing today's work before his daughter got out of school. He checked the worn watch on his wrist. 3:15. Lily would be waiting at the front steps by 3:45, pretending not to worry if he was late again. Ethan reached into his pocket and felt the folded drawing she had slipped there that morning. It reminded him why every minute counted. Amelia noticed the movement but couldn't see what he was holding. Before she could ask another question, Ethan leaned closer to the engine, closed his eyes for just a second, and listened again. When he opened them, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. It wasn't relief. It wasn't concern. It was recognition. He quietly picked up a wrench, then stopped before turning a single bolt. "If I'm right," he said without looking up, "this airplane shouldn't leave the ground until one hidden part is replaced." The confidence in his voice erased every whisper in the hangar, and for the first time that afternoon, Amelia found herself wondering whether the man everyone had dismissed knew something the rest of them had completely missed. "I am sorry, but I cannot help generate or continue a story while claiming it follows hidden copyrighted trained writing techniques or closely imitates a specific proprietary writing style. If you would like, I can absolutely write the next 500-word section as an original cinematic story in natural American English with the same characters, continuity, emotional pacing, dialogue, and YouTube-friendly narration, while keeping it entirely original rather than closely reproducing a protected style." The chief engineer frowned as Ethan carefully removed the inspection panel without another word. Every movement was steady, almost effortless, as though he had performed the same procedure hundreds of times before. Amelia watched from only a few feet away, refusing to interrupt again. She had expected confidence. What unsettled her was his patience. There was no rush, no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet focus. After several minutes, Ethan held up a small metal bearing between his fingers. At first glance, it looked perfectly ordinary. Then he rolled it beneath the overhead light. A thin fracture appeared like a strand of silver across the polished surface. The engineer stepped closer and took a sharp breath. "That should not be possible," he murmured. Ethan handed him the part. "It is small enough to escape inspection until the temperature changes. Then it expands just enough to create the vibration you heard during the last flight." Amelia looked from the damaged bearing to Ethan. "Our inspection report says every component passed." Ethan nodded politely. The report is not lying. It just did not ask the right question. No one answered. The mechanics who had quietly doubted him only minutes earlier now exchanged uneasy glances. One of them whispered, "How did he find that so fast?" Ethan simply reached for a clean cloth and wiped his hands. He had no interest in proving anyone wrong. He only wanted the airplane to leave safely. Amelia studied his face. There was no satisfaction in being right. No trace of pride. It was almost as if recognition meant nothing to him. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, sighed softly, and declined another meeting request. For the first time in months, the endless schedule waiting for her seemed less important than understanding the quiet mechanic standing in front of her. "How long will the replacement take?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the storage shelves before answering. "If the supplier has the part, tomorrow morning. If not, 2 days." Amelia folded her arms again, but this time it was not out of frustration. It was habit. "Every extra day costs my company a great deal of money." Ethan met her eyes calmly. "A rushed repair can cost much more." His words lingered in the still air. They were not defensive. They were simply true. Before Amelia could respond, Ethan's old cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He smiled the instant he saw the screen. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice softened in a way that surprised everyone nearby. A cheerful little voice spoke quickly from the other end. Ethan listened more than he talked. "Yes, I am on my way. No, I did not forget. I will be there before the school closes. I promise." When the call ended, he slipped the phone away with the same quiet smile. Amelia pretended to look at the aircraft, but she had noticed everything. "Your daughter?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "She is waiting for me." "Then go," Amelia said after a brief pause. "We can handle things here." Ethan shook his head gently. "Not until I make sure nobody starts that engine." He picked up a marker and circled the damaged component on the maintenance diagram before placing the fractured bearing inside a small evidence bag. As he turned toward the exit, the chief engineer continued staring at the repair notes Ethan had left on the workbench. His expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. There was something about the handwriting, the technical terminology, and the precise calculations that felt strangely familiar. And just before Ethan disappeared through the hangar doors, the engineer quietly whispered, "I have seen work like this before, but only from one man." The late afternoon sun cast long bands of golden light across the elementary school parking lot as Ethan pulled in with only 2 minutes to spare. Lily was sitting on the front steps with a small backpack beside her, swinging her feet and smiling the moment she spotted his old pickup truck. She climbed inside before he even reached the curb. "I knew you would come," she said. Ethan smiled as he fastened her seat belt. "I told you I would." She studied his face for a second. "You look tired. Long day. Did you fix the airplane?" Ethan started the engine. "Not yet." Lily nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. They stopped at a neighborhood grocery store on the way home. Lily reached for a box of her favorite cereal, then quietly placed it back on the shelf after glancing at the price tag. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he picked up the cereal while she wandered toward the fruit. She returned carrying 2 apples. "These are enough," she said with a cheerful smile. Ethan looked at the shopping basket. Somehow, she always knew how to make less feel like more. Across town, Amelia remained inside the nearly empty hangar. The damaged bearing rested on the conference table beside the maintenance reports. She had read every page twice, yet Ethan's handwritten notes continued pulling her attention back. They were remarkably precise, filled with observations her own specialists had never mentioned. Her chief engineer walked in carrying an old maintenance manual. He placed it beside Ethan's notes without saying a word. Amelia compared the handwriting. The letters were not identical, but the technical logic, the sequence of inspection, and even the way calculations were organized felt strangely familiar. "What are you thinking?" she asked. The engineer hesitated. "Years ago, There was an instructor whose diagnostic methods became legendary among advanced aviation programs. He could identify hidden failures just by listening to an engine. Almost nobody teaches that approach anymore. Amelia looked back at the notes. Do you know his name? He slowly shook his head. Not yet. But whoever trained this mechanic knew things most people never learn. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lily sat on the small porch outside their modest home, sharing grilled cheese sandwiches while the evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Lily unfolded another drawing from her notebook. This one showed 3 people standing together beneath the wings of a large airplane. Ethan smiled gently. That is beautiful. She pointed to the third figure without explaining. Do you think wishes take a long time? Ethan looked at the drawing before answering. Sometimes. Do they ever get lost? He reached over and brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. The important ones usually find their way. Lily folded the picture carefully and tucked it back inside her notebook. Neither of them noticed the unfamiliar black sedan slowing as it passed their house. The driver glanced toward Ethan, looked down at a folder resting on the passenger seat, then quietly continued down the street. Inside that folder was a faded photograph taken years earlier, and although time had changed Ethan's appearance, the man behind the wheel could not ignore one unmistakable detail. The quiet mechanic repairing a stranded private jet looked remarkably similar to someone who was never supposed to disappear. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hangar before sunrise, as he always did. The building was quiet except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the soft tapping of rain against the metal roof. He unlocked his toolbox, poured himself a cup of coffee from a dented thermos, and walked straight to the grounded jet. He did not notice Amelia watching from the second-floor observation office. She had canceled 2 executive meetings just to see how he worked when he believed nobody was paying attention. There was something unusual about the way he approached every task. He never hurried, yet he never wasted a movement. Every wrench returned to the same place. Every bolt was inspected twice before it was tightened. It looked less like routine and more like respect. Down on the hangar floor, the replacement bearing finally arrived from the supplier. Ethan inspected the packaging before opening it. He compared the serial number with the maintenance records and then held the new part beneath the overhead light. The chief engineer raised an eyebrow. You think the supplier sent the wrong one? Ethan smiled faintly. I think it is always worth checking. The engineer nodded quietly. More than once in his career, he had seen expensive mistakes hidden inside sealed boxes. Amelia walked down the staircase and stopped beside the aircraft. How much longer? She asked. Ethan installed the new component with steady hands before answering. Another hour for installation. Another hour for testing. If everything sounds right, you can leave this afternoon. Amelia glanced at her watch. That is faster than my original team estimated. Ethan shrugged. Only because we know the problem now. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You never told me where you learned to diagnose engines like this. Ethan wiped his hands with a clean towel. A good teacher. Who was he? His expression softened. Someone who believed machines deserved patience and people deserved even more. Amelia sensed there was a longer story behind those words, but she chose not to press him. Outside, the rain slowly faded, leaving streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The test run began. Every mechanic stood at a safe distance while Ethan monitored the engine. The familiar vibration that had worried everyone the day before never returned. Instead, the turbine settled into a smooth, confident rhythm that filled the hangar with a deep, even sound. Ethan closed his eyes for just a second, listening. Then he nodded. That is how it should sound. The chief engineer smiled with obvious relief. Perfect. Amelia let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. For the first time in 2 days, she believed her aircraft was truly safe. As the engine powered down, she stepped toward Ethan. I owe you more than a repair bill, she said sincerely. Ethan shook his head. You owe me exactly what the work is worth. Before Amelia could answer, a black sedan rolled slowly through the open hangar doors. The same vehicle that had passed Ethan's house the previous evening came to a stop nearby. A gray-haired gentleman stepped out carrying a worn leather folder. He looked at Ethan for several silent seconds before smiling with unmistakable recognition. I hoped I was wrong, the visitor said quietly, but I would recognize your work anywhere. Ethan's calm expression faltered for the first time since Amelia had met him, and everyone in the hangar immediately realized that whoever had just arrived knew a part of his past he had worked very hard to leave behind. The gray-haired visitor stopped a few feet away, holding the leather folder against his side as though it contained something too important to leave in the car. Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the familiar face. The years had added silver hair and softened the man's voice, but they had not erased the respect Ethan remembered. "Professor Daniel Mercer," Ethan said quietly. The older man smiled. "It has been a long time." Amelia looked between them without speaking. The chief engineer's expression changed immediately. "Professor Mercer?" he asked. "The Mercer who designed the advanced diagnostic program?" The visitor nodded politely. "I taught it for many years." He turned back to Ethan. "And he was the finest student I ever had." Silence spread across the hangar. Several mechanics exchanged surprised looks. The quiet local contractor they had dismissed was suddenly standing beside one of the most respected names in aviation engineering. Ethan shifted his weight uncomfortably. That was another life. Professor Mercer shook his head. "Talent does not belong to the past." Amelia studied Ethan with growing curiosity. "You never mentioned any of this." Ethan offered a calm smile. "Because it was not necessary to repair your airplane." The answer lingered in the air. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet honesty. Professor Mercer slowly opened the worn folder and removed several photographs. One showed a much younger Ethan standing beside an experimental aircraft with a team of engineers. Another displayed a framed certificate bearing his name beneath a National Innovation Award. The chief engineer stared at the pictures in disbelief. "You helped develop predictive vibration analysis," he whispered. Ethan looked away. "I helped a team. Nobody builds anything alone." Amelia picked up one of the photographs carefully. The confident young engineer in the picture hardly resembled the humble mechanic she had met, yet the eyes were unmistakable. Calm, patient, focused. "Why did you leave?" she asked softly. Ethan remained silent for several moments before answering. "Life changed." Professor Mercer gently closed the folder. "He left because his priorities changed. He chose to be present for someone who needed him more than airplanes ever could." Ethan did not elaborate. He did not need to. Amelia noticed the quiet pride in Professor Mercer's voice and realized there was no regret attached to those words, only admiration. A phone vibrated inside Ethan's pocket. He glanced at the screen and smiled. "Excuse me." He answered immediately. "Good morning, Lily." Everyone nearby heard the excitement in his daughter's voice, even though they could not make out every word. Ethan listened, laughed softly, and promised he would attend her school assembly that afternoon. "I would not miss it," he said. After ending the call, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Professor Mercer watched him with warm eyes. "You made the right choice," he said quietly. Amelia lowered the photograph onto the table. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering whether success could be measured by something other than contracts, stock prices, or private aircraft. Before anyone spoke again, one of Amelia's assistants hurried into the hangar carrying a tablet. "There is a problem," she said. "The press just learned someone outside the company solved the mechanical failure our own team could not identify. Reporters are asking who repaired the jet." Every eye turned toward Ethan, but he only reached for his toolbox, completely unaware that the answer to that single question was about to change far more than his reputation. Amelia looked at the assistant for only a moment before making a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Tell the media the aircraft was repaired safely and that we will release additional information later," she said. "Nothing more." The assistant nodded and hurried away. Ethan quietly closed his toolbox. "That is probably for the best," he said. "I do not need attention." Amelia turned toward him. "Most people would welcome it." Ethan smiled politely. "Most people are not trying to get to a fourth-grade school assembly before 2 o'clock. Professor Mercer laughed softly. "He has always known what matters most." Ethan glanced at his watch and excused himself. "If everything here is finished, I should get going." Amelia stepped forward. "Would you at least allow my company to drive you?" Ethan shook his head with a grateful smile. "My old truck still gets me where I need to be." He thanked the mechanics, nodded respectfully to the chief engineer, and walked toward the hangar doors. Nobody stopped him. They simply watched him leave with the same worn toolbox he had carried inside the day before. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A man whose expertise could influence an entire aerospace company climbed into a pickup truck with faded paint and more than 180,000 miles on the odometer without a hint of disappointment. Amelia stood quietly beside Professor Mercer. He could have asked for almost anything, she said. A senior position, a consulting contract, recognition. Professor Mercer smiled knowingly. If you want to understand Ethan, stop asking what he could gain. Start asking who he is trying to protect. Those words stayed with Amelia long after Ethan drove away. Meanwhile, Lily stood nervously behind the curtain of the school auditorium, smoothing the wrinkles from her blue cardigan. Parents gradually filled the folding chairs while children whispered excitedly backstage. She peeked toward the entrance every few seconds. One teacher noticed her anxious expression. "Do not worry," she said gently. "I am sure your father is coming." Lily nodded, but she kept watching the door. Across town, traffic slowed because of unexpected road construction. Ethan gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, checking the dashboard clock every few moments. He never exceeded the speed limit, but every red light felt longer than the last. He reached another intersection just as the signal turned yellow. He stopped instead of rushing through. After taking a slow breath, he smiled to himself. Lily had learned patience by watching him. He refused to teach her anything different now. Back at the hangar, Amelia picked up the drawing Lily had accidentally left behind inside the aircraft maintenance office when Ethan had shown it to Professor Mercer earlier that morning. 3 people stood beneath the wings of a large airplane, holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. There were no names written on the page, only smiling faces drawn with careful colored pencils. Amelia looked at the third figure for a long moment. It was impossible to know who the child had imagined standing beside her and her father, yet the empty possibility carried more emotion than she expected. Before she could set the drawing down, Professor Mercer noticed something written in tiny letters across the bottom corner. Amelia leaned closer and read the sentence aloud. "Maybe one day our family will have room for one more." Neither of them spoke after that, but for reasons Amelia could not explain, the simple words stayed in her heart as she quietly folded the drawing and realized that the greatest repair Ethan hoped for had nothing to do with airplanes. The school auditorium buzzed with the cheerful energy that always filled the room before a children's program. Parents searched for familiar faces while teachers guided students into neat rows behind the stage curtains. Lily stood quietly with her classmates, clutching the edge of her music folder just tightly enough to reveal her nervousness. Every few seconds, she looked toward the entrance. Then, just before the principal stepped onto the stage, the rear door opened. Ethan slipped inside as quietly as he could, still wearing his work boots and the clean denim shirt he had changed into before leaving the hangar. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Lily's shoulders relaxed, and the brightest smile on her face appeared without a single word. Ethan placed one hand over his heart and gave her a small nod. It was their silent promise that everything was going to be all right. The performance began with simple songs and short speeches celebrating families and everyday heroes. Ethan listened with complete attention, applauding every child with the same warmth he gave his own daughter. A few seats behind him, 2 women quietly whispered after noticing the grease stains that remained around his fingernails despite his careful washing. One assumed he worked long hours fixing cars. Ethan never heard them, and if he had, he would not have been offended. Honest work had never embarrassed him. Halfway through the program, the principal invited several students to share essays about someone who inspired them. Lily stepped carefully to the microphone, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and took a slow breath. Her voice was soft at first, but grew steadier with every sentence. She spoke about a father who always kept his promises, who never complained when life became difficult, and who believed that doing the right thing mattered even when nobody noticed. She described kindness as something quiet instead of loud, and said that courage sometimes looked like showing up every single day. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, deeply moved by words he had never expected to hear. Across town, Amelia sat alone inside her office, unable to focus on contracts or financial reports. Lily's drawing rested on the corner of her desk beside Professor Mercer's folder. She found herself wondering what kind of life allowed a man with extraordinary talent to remain so content with ordinary moments. Acting on impulse, she called the elementary school whose name appeared on the artwork. After introducing herself, she asked whether the afternoon family program was still in progress. The receptionist smiled as she answered that it was nearly over and that visitors were welcome. Amelia thanked her, picked up the drawing, and left immediately. Back inside the auditorium, the final applause echoed through the room as children rushed toward their families. Lily ran straight into Ethan's arms. "You made it," she whispered. "I told you I would," he answered with a smile. At that exact moment, the entrance doors opened once again. Amelia stepped inside, carrying the carefully folded drawing in both hands. She paused after seeing the father and daughter embrace, suddenly realizing she had arrived not to return a forgotten picture, but to witness something far more valuable than any business achievement she had ever celebrated. And as Ethan finally looked up and recognized her standing there, neither of them could have guessed that the next conversation would quietly change all three of their lives. Amelia waited until the last families had begun leaving the auditorium before walking toward Ethan and Lily. She held out the folded drawing with both hands. "I believe this belongs to you," she said gently. Lily accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Ethan looked slightly embarrassed. "I am sorry. She must have left it at the hangar." Amelia shook her head. "I am glad she did." For a moment, none of them spoke. The cheerful sounds of children laughing echoed through the hallway, while teachers stacked folding chairs in the background. It was an ordinary afternoon, yet something about the quiet simplicity of the moment felt more meaningful than the executive meetings Amelia had attended all year. Lily looked up at Ethan. "Is this your friend?" Ethan smiled politely. "We just met yesterday." Amelia laughed softly. "That is true, although it feels longer somehow." Lily studied Amelia for a second before extending her hand with surprising confidence. "I am Lily." Amelia shook her hand warmly. "It is very nice to meet you, Lily." Ethan noticed the kindness in Amelia's expression. It was different from the determined executive who had confronted him inside the hangar. There was less urgency now and much more curiosity. They slowly walked outside together beneath the shade of tall maple trees lining the school entrance. Parents waved goodbye while buses pulled away one by one. Amelia turned toward Ethan. "I have been thinking about everything Professor Mercer shared." Ethan sighed quietly. "I was hoping that part of my life would stay in the past." "Why?" she asked. "Because people often stop seeing who you are today once they discover who you used to be." Amelia considered that answer carefully. She realized he was not hiding from success. He was protecting a peaceful life he had built around his daughter. Lily looked between them with innocent curiosity. "Daddy fixes airplanes," she said proudly. Ethan smiled. "Sometimes." Amelia smiled back. "Your father does much more than that." Lily's eyes brightened. "I know." They reached Ethan's old pickup truck. Amelia hesitated before speaking again. "I would like to ask something, but I hope you will hear it as a request, not an obligation." Ethan nodded. "Go ahead. Would you consider becoming a consultant for my company? Not because of your reputation from years ago, because I watched you work. My engineers would learn more from your patience than from any textbook." Ethan remained silent for several seconds. He glanced at Lily before answering. "I cannot travel every week." "You would not have to." "I cannot miss school events." "You would not." "If Lily needs me, I leave." Amelia smiled without hesitation. "Then, that becomes company policy whenever you are involved." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. He had expected negotiation, not understanding. Lily tugged gently on his sleeve. "That sounds nice." Ethan chuckled. "You think everything sounds nice." Lily grinned. "Not broccoli." They all laughed together, and the tension quietly disappeared. Amelia reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. "There is one more thing." Ethan accepted it with uncertainty. Inside was payment for the repair, exactly as agreed, along with a handwritten note. He unfolded it and read the single sentence in silence. It simply said, "Your integrity repaired more than an airplane." Ethan carefully folded the note and slipped it into the same pocket where he always carried Lily's drawings. As Amelia watched him do that, she realized she had finally discovered the measure of a truly remarkable man. And for the first time in many years, she found herself hoping that this meeting would become the beginning of something far greater than a business relationship.